Whenever anybody talks about grenadine, the first assumption is that it's made from pomegranate. And that may not be the case. It is for some, but if you go back to the early 1900s, you'll find that it's more likely related to the carnation flower called a Clove-Pink. And that has a completely different taste than your typical grenadine today, though this may be based on it. It's a complex story, so let's sort it out. I'm Darcy O'Neill, this is Art of Drink. I've written a book on the history of the soda fountain, and while I was doing research, I stumbled across an old recipe for something called grenadine, and it did not include any pomegranate, though it did mention the pomegranate in a different recipe. So how do we sort this out? Well, if we go back and we look at what grenadine actually was, it was a type of flour, and it was used in drinks in the 1600s. It was called a gillyflower. Eventually became known as a Clove-Pink, and not because it's pink, it's actually a crimson color. The pinking comes from the fact that the edge of the leaf is frilled, so like pinking shears, if you think about that, where it gives that frilly edge on paper. The flowers grow that way, so they're called clove-pinks. The pink being the pinking, the clove because they had a clove aroma. Now if you were to take that and then you look at a pomegranate, you're not going to find, you don't think you'll find clove in a pomegranate, but you might. At least eugenol, which is the oil of cloves. Now, I've made this last year when I wrote an article on Art of Drink about it, and it's completely different to your generic grenadines. Now, a lot of people, or a lot of companies are making grenadine from pure pomegranate juice. That may not be true, though it was called for in the tiki world. So if you make tiki drinks, that's the way to go. But if you're looking at cocktails in the early 1900s, you may be looking more at this recipe, which was to reproduce the flower, a Clove-Pink. Because what they used to do is they'd take the Clove-Pinks and they'd soak them in wine. And then eventually that stayed at the soda fountain or the pharmacy, and then that became more of a flavoring as we know today. Now some people will say that pomegranates were always used, but not necessarily. There was actually a patent filed in the 1870s for pomegranate grenadine. Now just because a patent exists doesn't mean that this stuff was used. One of the things about patents in the early days was that it prevented anybody else from selling this product for 14 years. Even in the US court, when it came to a lawsuit around 1910, I believe 1914, was that grenadine was not considered pomegranate. It was considered a red syrup made with flavorings. It didn't mean it couldn't be pomegranate, but legally grenadine was not pomegranate syrup. So you have this thing where if you're looking at something like a Jack Rose cocktail or even a Shirley Temple, this grenadine is much different than the fake stuff we have today. And this smells mostly like vanilla, though in the original one there was vanilla. Now there's lots of drinks in the early 1900s, from about 1900 to Prohibition, 1919, in old cocktail books that called for grenadine. But this originally came from the soda fountain. I have yet to find a recipe for grenadine syrup or pomegranate syrup in any cocktail book. But they are in soda fountain manuals and historical soda fountain journals or pharmacy journals. That's where I find these recipes. So I suspect that it migrated from the soda fountain, like a lot of things did, into the bar. Now this recipe is pretty simple. It just has a base of alcohol. Use what you can. I'm going to be using, again, my standard 85% or 80% that I make with a still. But if you have access to Everclear, that stuff is the best stuff to use for this recipe, or any high-proof spirit, even if it's a vodka like Spiritus, which is around 76%, that will work perfectly fine too. So what you need is clove oil, and this is pretty easy to come by. You're only going to need 6 drops of this, so this will last a lifetime. The next is going to be orange oil. Now, I use orange sweet oil, so this comes from sweet orange peels, but you can also use bitter orange peel, and you're only going to need 18 drops. Now, I will include the recipe below, but on Art of Drink, I have a very thorough discussion about this recipe, but you can use any orange oil. You can, whenever I do these things, I want you to experiment. You can create this one to start, but branch out. You can use mandarin oil. You can use any other type like clementine oil in place of your orange oil if you want to have your own unique flavor. Now the next step is ginger tincture. Now I've made this in a previous video for ginger syrup. You don't actually have to make this if you don't want to. What you could probably get away using 1 to 2 mils of ginger juice. So press your ginger, take a mil of that, and add it to this bottle when we're going to make it. And that will actually be enough of the ginger compound, because one of the things you'll find with this when you make it is it does have a tangy flavor, kind of like fruit. So that's one of the things, is you don't need to make the ginger tincture, though I have it, so I'm going to use it. And then you're going to need vanilla essence or vanilla extract, and we're going to need 5 mils of that. You use a little bit more. Back in the historical days, vanilla extract was a little bit stronger than it is today. Now for the red color, you can use cochineal. For me, this is Carmine Alum Lakes, which is the same thing, but it's a commercial product. I basically decided to skip the red. When I was actually making this version about a year ago, a little less than a year ago, I added the coloring and then I filtered it out because I was like, it doesn't need to be that bright red. And we're going to talk about that probably in a future video. But this syrup's neat when you don't actually dye it. It can come out pretty much clear. And if you're making a Jack Rose with Applejack, you're going to get more interesting. It's not going to be the red color. And the name Jack Rose comes from Applejack and possibly the color red, which is rose, but we know that this syrup is made from carnations, so that name doesn't fit. Now, the other thing you're going to need is acid. The original recipe calls for diluted phosphoric acid. Acid phosphate works. So if you have that on hand, this is basically diluted phosphoric acid with salts that buffer it. So it keeps the pH more in line, so you keep that tangy flavor. But if you have it, this is perfect for it. And then the last ingredient is maraschino, and you need about 2 ounces of this. Now, if you don't have access to maraschino, I do have a recipe for it. Again, the recipe is slightly more complex than this, but any maraschino will work. And for some reason, this recipe does not work without it. All of that requires 16 ounces or 480 mils of high-proof ethanol. When you mix that, you're going to end up with something like this, which is called grenadine essence. Now, if you take the red color out, I filtered out most of it, so my grenadine comes out very light pink now. But 1 ounce of this will make 1 liter, so these are 2 500 ml bottles, or basically 2 pints of grenadine syrup. If you only have vodka, that will work. This will come out cloudy, but when you mix it in your syrup, it will mostly clear up. There'll be a slight haze, but once it goes into your drink, it's going to be pretty much clear. So there's no issues with using a lower proof alcohol. The only difference is that if you want to increase the flavor, so you want to double your clove and double your orange oil because you want more punch in that, that may not go easily into low proof alcohol. So at that point, if you're making for a more punchier grenadine, you'll have to up it, or up the ABV on that. So let me show you how easy it is to make this grenadine syrup. First, you're going to need a beaker, and we're going to need some alcohol. Now, we don't need to be accurate at this point. We're just going to dissolve the oils into the alcohol. We will top up, and eventually we'll just get our 240 mils, because I'm doing a half batch because I already have a full pint here that I don't need that much more. So first thing is clove bud oil, or clove oil. And we only need 3 drops of this. And clove oil can be quite potent, so if you go 1 drop further, it's not going to make a big deal, but if you do too much, you'll definitely notice the clove. And then we're going to need 9 drops of, this is sweet orange oil. But you can use bitter orange or, as I said, clementine, tangerine, if you want to put your own spin on it. Now we will need some vanilla extract. Now I know my bar spoon's 2.5 mils. I could just go in there. Now you can use 1 mil of fresh pressed ginger juice, but I've already made a ginger extract, so I'm going to add 2 mils because I'm doing a half batch. Normally it'd be 4. Again, this is, I'm making half a pint, which is enough to make 8 liters of grenadine. You can do bigger batches, I already have enough. So once we get all that in, just give it a stir. Then we're going to add our maraschino, and we need to add 1 ounce of this. And yes, it will go cloudy. That's because of the sugar in this. It's not going to dissolve particularly well in alcohol, but in the recipe you'll see where it says to add water. And a little distilled water, especially if you're using Everclear or a high proof alcohol, will make a difference. So you can see that it's already started to clear up with the addition of the water. So at this point we can add it to our bottle. You can see that it's pretty much clear. There's a slight haze to it. Then you just want to rinse a little bit with some alcohol to get the oils out. And you'll notice that I am skipping the cochineal or the red coloring because I want to demonstrate something about making these syrups. You don't always have to color them. Now again, when you rinse, you'll notice that some of the sugar comes out from the maraschino, but if you give it a double rinse, you're going to get almost all of the oil out, and that's the important part. Then you just top this up. So that's good, and you'll see that this comes out pretty much clear. But we are going to give it a good shake just to make sure all the oils are emulsified in there. And then that will clear up. But now what you have is basically a grenadine essence. Now, if you go watch the video on the essence that I've done in the past, it'll explain more about essences. But for our purposes, 1 ounce of this in 1 quart or 1 liter of syrup. So 30 mils, 1 ounce into 1 quart or 1 liter of simple syrup, and you will have grenadine syrup. So let's just do that. Well, I use what the soda fountains did, which is 3-to-2 simple syrup, so 3 parts sugar, 2 parts water. That's basically the standard. It mixed better at the soda fountain. Then we add that to the simple syrup. And that is your grenadine syrup. And you'll notice obviously that it's pretty clear. An ounce, because an ounce of this would be typically used in soda. However, it doesn't work very well in soda. Oops, I'll do this as they did at the soda fountain, solid. And the reason you serve things solid is that it doesn't cause things to foam, and you keep more carbonation in the drink. But you don't even need to stir it when you do that. And then what you get is, it is fruity. It's hard to describe what it is, but it does taste good. I find this method easier than, pressing pomegranates or buying pomegranates. It's cheaper. and you have more room to modify, and it does taste fruity like grenadine. And here's the interesting thing. It's artificial grenadine, but it's made from all natural ingredients. It's artificial because it obviously doesn't use any pomegranate in it, if you're going by the definition of grenadine as pomegranate, though I go by the definition that it's the flower, the gillyflower or the Clove-Pink is where this came from. But so technically it's an artificial flavor made from all natural ingredients. There's nothing in this that is unnatural. All of these are natural steam distilled essential oils, and we made the ginger from powdered ginger. So this is one of those things where labeling can't define what things are. So anyway, once you work with this, you can add the red color, but if you are making a Jack Rose with Applejack, you're going to have more of a brown drink. You can add caramel coloring to this. You could dye it green if you wanted, but you can play with this any way you want. One of the things I've come across through the whole soda fountain thing is that the flavor profile of drinks back in the 1800s is not as intense as we find them today. Coca-Cola is particularly intense, and that seems to be the standard for where drinks are set. So you can either add 2 ounces of essence to this, or just, instead of making 1 pint of essence, just double up your half pint. So instead of 3 drops of clove oil, 6 drops of clove oil. Instead of 9 drops of orange oil, 18 drops of orange oil. 2 mils of fresh pressed ginger juice, or if you're making ginger extract, 4-5 mils. Just this idea that you make it more intense. And the one thing I did forget to add was acid. So I'm just going to add a little bit, because that's probably what it's missing, is that tangy part. Now you can add your acid to the simple syrup. It'll give it a longer shelf life. But again, if you add a little bit of acid to this, it's probably going to make it better. That was my mistake, but corrected now. And yes, now you're starting to get the tanginess from the fruit. So that is how to make grenadine syrup. And it's pretty simple. Don't forget the acid like I did. It makes a big difference. Again, you can use citric acid, or you can use lime juice if you want. Again, 1 bottle is going to make you 8 liters, or 1 half-pint bottle is going to make you 8 liters. And if you start doing pints, you're into the 16 liter. And it's dirt cheap. Again, there's nothing expensive other than the alcohol, but you're still saving lots of money. You're doing it in-house, and you can put your own twist on it. If you've enjoyed this video, please feel free to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.